Welcome to Taiwan Tech Dispatch. I'm your host, White Shu. This is episode 50. And today, I want to explore a paradox at the heart of Taiwan's semiconductor strategy. Earlier this year, I was interviewed by a mainstream European business media outlet. One of the first questions they asked me was, why is Europe paying so much attention to Taiwan semiconductors and TSMC right now? The obvious answer is supply chain security. But I think there is a much more interesting question underneath it. As TSMC builds fabs in Europe, the United States, and Japan, does Taiwan become less important? Or could the opposite actually be happening? Could TSMC's globalization actually make Taiwan stronger? That is what I call TSMC's globalization paradox. Chapter 1: Europe's Semiconductor Wake-Up Call. A decade ago, Europe largely treated semiconductors as components in a global supply chain. Then came the pandemic. Chip shortages disrupted factories, delayed vehicles, and exposed just how dependent Europe's industrial economy has become on semiconductor production thousands of kilometers away. Geopolitical tensions made that vulnerability even harder to ignore. Semiconductors were no longer simply a procurement issue. They had become critical infrastructure, and TSMC was no longer simply another supplier. It had become a strategic dependency. The shift helps explain Dresden. But there is something important about the European project that is often misunderstood. Chapter 2: Dresden is not really an AI story. When people hear TSMC today, they often immediately think about artificial intelligence, NVIDIA, AI accelerators, 2-nanometer technology, massive data centers. But Dresden is a different story. The European fab focuses on mature and specialty semiconductor technologies. And that tells us exactly why TSMC is there. Europe remains one of the world's most important centers for automotive and industrial manufacturing. Modern vehicles require increasing numbers of semiconductors for electrification, battery management, safety systems, sensors, connectivity, and advanced driver assistance. But automotive customers don't necessarily need the smallest transistor. They need reliability, longevity, traceability, and predictable supply. The same is true for industrial automation, energy infrastructure, and power systems. That is why Dresden is closely connected to companies such as Bosch, Infineon, and NXP. TSMC Europe is now primarily an AI story. It is an industrial resilience story. Chapter 3: The Three Layers of TSMC's moat. And this is where the story becomes much more interesting. Most people think about TSMC's competitive advantage in terms of technology, and that is certainly the first layer of its moat. Advanced process technology, yield, manufacturing precision, decades of research and development. Crucially, Taiwan remains the center of this layer. TSMC's deepest engineering capabilities and most advanced manufacturing ecosystem remain heavily anchored here. But there is a second layer, execution and scale. Knowing how to manufacture an advanced semiconductor is one thing. Producing millions of them consistently at high yield while meeting the schedules of the world's largest technology companies is something else entirely. And then there is a third layer, one that I think is still underestimated: trust. More specifically, a global trust-based manufacturing network. Look at the structure TSMC is building. Taiwan remains the advanced technology and R&D core. The United States brings manufacturing closer to major high-performance computing and strategic customers. Japan connects TSMC with specialty semiconductor demand and a powerful materials and manufacturing ecosystem. And Europe brings production closer to automotive and industrial customers. These are not simply four groups of factories. They are nodes inside one global manufacturing system. And that sends a powerful message to customers. Customers do not always have to adapt to TSMC's geography. TSMC is increasingly adapting its geography to its customers. That is why I think TSMC is no longer simply exporting chips from Taiwan. It is exporting trust from Taiwan. Chapter 4: Why going global may make Taiwan stronger. This brings us to the central paradox. If TSMC keeps building fabs overseas, doesn't Taiwan eventually become less important? At first, that argument sounds reasonable. Taiwan's semiconductor advantage has historically been built on concentration. The fabs are here, the engineers are here, the suppliers are here, and much of the knowledge is here. But TSMC is not simply dividing Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem into smaller pieces and shipping them overseas. Instead, different regions are developing different roles within the same network. Taiwan remains the technological heart. America provides proximity to strategic and high-performance computing demand. Japan strengthens integration with specialty manufacturing and the materials ecosystem. Europe provides proximity to automotive and industrial customers. This is not simply decentralization. It is specialization within a global network. And Taiwan remains at the center. That distinction matters. If everything is produced in Taiwan, customers depend heavily on Taiwan. But they also worry about geographic concentration. If TSMC can distribute some manufacturing capacity while keeping its technology engine, engineering depth, R&D capabilities, and ecosystem coordination anchored in Taiwan. Something interesting happens. Customers can reduce geographic risk without reducing their dependence on TSMC's core capabilities. That is the globalization paradox. TSMC can reduce the risk of depending on Taiwan while increasing the value of the global system that Taiwan sits at the center of. In that sense, overseas fabs may not weaken Taiwan's semiconductor moat. They may actually widen it. Chapter 5, the competition is becoming system level. This also changes how we should think about TSMC's competition with Intel and Samsung. Semiconductor competition is often described as a race toward the next process node. But technology is now only one part of the challenge. To replicate TSMC's position, a competitor needs competitive technology and strong yield, but it also needs enormous manufacturing scale, deep customer relationships, global supply chain coordination, thousands of experienced engineers, and the willingness to make irreversible multi-billion-dollar capital commitments across several countries. Most importantly, customers need to believe that this manufacturing system will reliably support their products for years. So the competitive question is changing. It is no longer only who has the best semiconductor node. It is increasingly who can build the world's most trusted semiconductor manufacturing system. That is a much harder moat to cross. Chapter 6, Taiwan's new semiconductor moat. For years, people have talked about Taiwan's so-called silicon shield. The basic idea is that Taiwan manufactures semiconductors the global economy cannot easily replace. But perhaps that idea is evolving. Taiwan's future strategic importance may not depend on keeping every important semiconductor fab physically on the island. Instead, Taiwan may become even more important as the technological and operational center of a manufacturing network spanning the world's major industrial economies. Taiwan matters not simply because everything is made here. Taiwan matters because the global system is extremely difficult to operate without what has been built here. The engineers, the R&D infrastructure, the supplier relationships, the manufacturing culture, the accumulated process knowledge, and the ability to coordinate all of those capabilities across continents. Closing, the globalization paradox. So let's return to Europe. TSMC's investment in Dresden is about much more than another semiconductor fab. It represents a fundamental shift in how Europe sees Taiwan and the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are infrastructure, and infrastructure ultimately depends on trust. That is why TSMC Europe is not simply an investment into manufacturing capacity. It is an investment in trust. And that brings us back to the paradox. But the farther TSMC expands beyond Taiwan, the more deeply the world's major economies become connected to the manufacturing system that Taiwan created. Taiwan remains the technological heart, but the arteries now extend around the world. And perhaps that is the next evolution of Taiwan's semiconductor moat. Not simply concentration, but becoming the indispensable center of a global network built on technology, execution, and trust. This is Taiwan Tech Dispatch. I'm White H. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Taiwan Tech Dispatch on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with someone interested in semiconductors, technology, or Taiwan's role in the global economy. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.